Iraq is seeing an escalation in the Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict as the Shiite-dominated government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki seeks to tighten political control and power. Joining us now to help examine the rising violence in Iraq and the looming spectre of a new civil war in a region already under the strain of the Syrian conflict, in Washington, D.C., Kenneth Pollack. He is a senior fellow in the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. And Ken, it's good to have you on TVO tonight. How are you?
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Steve.
I think just so we might start here to understand the nature of this conflict, how many sides do you see in this war?
Well, obviously, this is a civil conflict, as you were pointing out in your introduction. You can carve it up in a whole variety of different ways. But I would say that there are at least three, maybe four, if you want to add in the Kurds. But the ones that really matter are, obviously, you've got the government, which, as you pointed out, is dominated by the Shia, although there are splits within the Shia faction as well. But there certainly is a large faction of the Shia populace that is behind the government at the moment when it comes to security. And then you've got within the Sunni community a very important split. And that split is between those very radicalized Sunnis who've basically decided that the Shia-dominated government really is the enemy. Those are the people who are at least allied with or providing passive support to al-Qaeda. And then you've got a moderate group within the Sunni camp. People who remember the Civil War, remember the problems that they faced, remembered what it was like living under al-Qaeda. They don't want to go back to that, but by the same token, they do share the unhappiness of the radical Sunnis with the government. So it's that group that in many ways is the most interesting, the Sunni moderates who feel themselves caught between, on the one hand, a Shia-dominated government that they don't like, that they feel is oppressing them and preventing them from sharing in Iraq's political and economic wealth, and on the other hand, al-Qaeda and their own radicals who are trying to push them, or pull them might be a better way to describe it, towards civil war, something else, or toward al-Qaeda's dominance, two things that they're not interested in either.
Let's just put things in perspective, though. When we talk about a moderate party in Canada, we mean one thing. When you talk about moderate Sunni influence in the region that we're talking about tonight, I think we need to understand better what moderate means in that case. Can you help us there?
Absolutely. You know, this is Iraq. Iraq is a violent society. It has come through a long civil war. Even before that, it lived under a series of dictatorships that culminated in Saddam Hussein's tyranny. So when you say moderate by Iraqi standards, yes, it's going to mean something different than by Canadian standards. That said, I think that we can recognize these Sunnis, who I'm calling moderates, as real moderates in the sense that they're not looking for a resumption of the violence. They certainly don't want to go back to al-Qaeda. They're not looking to promote terrorism across the region. And typically what they talk about is something that I think everyone in Canada or elsewhere would find entirely reasonable, which is that they're looking for their community to be treated fairly, to be treated fairly under the law, to be treated by due process of law and not arbitrarily arrested, searched, seized, killed even, and also looking to have political and economic weight and a share of Iraq's economic wealth that is commensurate with their demographic weight in the society. So in effect, what they're saying is Iraq was meant to be a democracy, and what we're looking for is simply that we are treated fairly under that system of government. And their argument, of course, is that they haven't been treated fairly since the United States left, since Prime Minister Maliki has been more in charge of Iraq.
So do I infer from your comments that if this group, the so-called Sunni moderates, can be positively engaged or reasonably accommodated, there is the potential there for some kind of peace? Or is that going too far?
Well, that certainly is their argument, and I think that it is a reasonable one. I think that it is mostly the case that they would be accommodated by that, certainly in the sense that I don't think they're looking for violence, and if they felt like they were more part of the political process and were getting more of their fair share of the economic spoils and more of their fair share of Iraq's political power, that they would be comfortable with that. Now, obviously, again, it's Iraq. Iraqi politics are tend to be rather bruising, and there would always be fights among different groups and among different parties for who gets more and who gets less and who gets this ministry as opposed to that ministry. It's not as if everything is going to be wonderful and peaceful and Iraq is going to turn into Switzerland if the Sunnis get their stake. It's simply that what these moderate Sunnis are saying is, look, we're not looking to go down the route of violence. We remember what that was like in 2005 and 6 and 7. We really don't want to go down that path, but the problem we have is that our people and we ourselves feel badly oppressed by the government. We feel like we are being denied our rights, our livelihoods, in many cases our freedom and our lives themselves, and that's got to end. And if that ends, then we can become more a part of the normal political process.
Let me ask you about a discussion that you recently moderated with the Speaker of Iraq's Council of Representatives and get you to tell us whether you thought that he thought his country was on the verge of an all-out civil war.
Sure, I think it's an important question, but I want to start by saying that I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, and I'll be honest with you, I cannot remember if the speaker used the word civil war. The transcript is up on our website, the Brookings website. Your viewers are welcome to go in and check the record. What I think is fair to say, though, is that the speaker was warning that the situation is very tense. He talked about this split within the Sunni community, and he is probably the leading Sunni Iraqi politician. He talked about this division between the more radical elements and the more moderate elements, and how the more moderate elements felt very badly pulled in both directions on the horns of a dilemma. And he talked about how it could be fairly easy to push the Sunni community into much more widespread resistance, into a much more violent form of resistance. If in particular, he was warning the Iraqi elections, which are scheduled for late April, do not go well if the Sunni community believes that they were cheated in those elections, that Iraq's political process was not respected and Iraq's laws were not respected, that could easily push the Sunni community toward greater violence. And while he may or may not have used the word, I will simply say that I think that would be a recipe for the resumption of civil war.
Let's try also to figure out where Syria works its way into this recipe. Did he believe, I guess I should ask it this way, what impact did he believe the Syrian conflagration, for lack of a better word, is contributing to the situation in Iraq today?
Well, of course, being a Sunni Iraqi political leader, he tended to downplay Syria's role. And it's important to keep in mind, of course, I've been giving you the Sunni narrative. There is, of course, a Shia narrative. There is the Prime Minister's narrative, which, of course, is very different. But the point that he made was, look, Syria is out there. It certainly is creating problems, but this is really an Iraqi problem. And this is really about an Iraqi government that is depriving Iraq's Sunni community, again, of its rightful political and economic due. And that's really what he stressed. And of course, that is the principal argument of Iraq's Sunni community.
Well, then following on those lines and taking those admonitions into account that you just put on the record, where did he lay the blame for the, I guess, massive uptick in violence that we've seen lately in cities like Fallujah and Ramadi?
Yeah, from his perspective, this is principally something that needs to be laid at the feet of the Prime Minister and his policies and the current government in Iraq. Again, his argument is that, and I think that many outside scholars feel the same way. I think there's a certain amount of credibility to this argument, a lot of evidence to support it, that the Prime Minister made a number of moves that alienated Iraq's Sunni community, that left them feeling deprived, and left them feeling not just deprived, but besieged by this government, oppressed by this government, and that fear, the fear that this government was going to treat them as badly as Iraq's Shia had been treated under Saddam Hussein, that fear is what has driven many Sunnis back into the arms of al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and could potentially drive much more. And of course, his argument is that the Prime Minister needs to make concessions, he needs to make compromises, and he needs to live up to the promises that he made early on. In particular, a very important agreement that was forged at Erbil. It's called the Erbil Agreement in 2010, that is part of Iraq's last political elections, laid the basis for Prime Minister Maliki to resume his post in return for making a number of compromises and concessions to different Iraqi groups, compromises and concessions which those groups believe that the Prime Minister did not live up to, did not fulfill.
Ken, let me ask you what I guess might be colloquially called the $64,000 question that I suspect certainly I and a number of viewers find confusing, which is all those years ago, 9/11 took place. The Bush administration made a decision to go into Iraq, ostensibly to root out the al-Qaeda influence, which it thought was behind 9/11. They got there, they discovered there was no al-Qaeda in Iraq, and now suddenly, 13 years later, we discover that al-Qaeda is actually behind a lot of what's going on in Iraq these days, the massive uptick in violence. How did that happen?
Well, I think you've actually laid it out very nicely, Steve, which is that the Bush administration invaded Iraq for a variety of different reasons, but you're absolutely right that one of them was that many folks in the Bush administration were absolutely convinced that Saddam Hussein was tied to al-Qaeda. In fact, I will go farther than that. From my own conversations, my own arguments with many of them at the time, they were certain that al-Qaeda was, in fact, ultimately a creation or a subsidiary of Iraq. They just did not believe that these kind of transnational actors could exist on their own. They saw the world as a grouping of nation states. They assumed that al-Qaeda had to be backed, if not ultimately controlled by some state entity, and that was Saddam Hussein. So they went in absolutely convinced that al-Qaeda was tied to Saddam Hussein, was supported by Saddam Hussein, and that therefore 9/11 was ultimately connected to Saddam Hussein. That was wrong. That was wrong at the time. And any number of people, myself, but more important than myself, the intelligence community, the United States intelligence community was saying very vociferously that the ties between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and al-Qaeda were exceptionally tenuous. They might be there, but they were not meaningful in any sense. Many in the Bush administration disregarded that, but let's remember others had other reasons for going into Iraq. Let's remember that while the intelligence community was right ultimately that al-Qaeda was not tied to Iraq, the intelligence community was wrong about Saddam's decision to rebuild its weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence community believed that Saddam had decided to reconstitute its weapons of mass destruction. That was another reason that the Bush administration decided to go into Iraq. But you're absolutely right. There were no ties. There really was no al-Qaeda in Iraq before the United States invaded. And once we invaded, and in particular, because we made no effort to fully occupy the country, to secure it, to rebuild its security capabilities, and rebuild a functional political system immediately after invading, we opened the door to al-Qaeda. And then worse, and this kind of gets us back to the current situation, we helped alienate Iraq's Sunni community. We treated them as if they were all Saddam's accomplices or al-Qaeda's accomplices. We helped exclude them from government early on. In many cases, we put some of the worst elements in the Shia community in charge of Iraq. And so it was not surprising that many Sunnis came to see the United States as the enemy and saw al-Qaeda as their only ally. And so a country that really had no al-Qaeda presence suddenly became a real pocket of al-Qaeda resistance.
A clarification, though, if I could. You say that all of what transpired over the past decade or more has, quote unquote, opened the door to al-Qaeda. That suggests, if I'm inferring properly, that they came in from the outside as opposed to were a homegrown phenomenon. Which would you say is more accurate?
I think that it's a sequential issue. They first came in from the outside, and then they became a homegrown outfit. So al-Qaeda really wasn't present in Iraq to begin with. But what happened was almost immediate. In fact, al-Qaeda was starting to try to get into Iraq even before the U.S. invasion. But once we invaded and took down Saddam Hussein's security apparatus, which, remember, was enormous and incredibly formidable and incredibly good at keeping out all kinds of outside influences, including al-Qaeda. Once that was taken down and we did not replace it, that allowed these foreigners to come into Iraq. They started fighting against us. They started fighting against the Shia. They started reaching out to the Sunnis. And over the course of time, they were able to make inroads into the Sunni community. But it's worth noting that early on, they didn't get a whole lot of traction among the Iraqis because, quite frankly, Iraqis tend to be very nationalistic. And they were actually very reticent about these foreigners coming into their country and wanting to fight different different groups within their country. But over time, as the Sunni community was alienated by the United States and by our allies in the Shia community, that more and more drove the Sunnis, the Sunni Iraqis, into the arms of al-Qaeda. And at that moment, al-Qaeda did become an indigenous force. And by the time that the height of the Civil War was reached, by 2006 or so, al-Qaeda was very much an indigenous force, which simply had kind of an overlay of these foreigners still, but it was dominated largely by Iraqis.
Ken, we've just got a few minutes left here, and I want to tackle a couple of more things if I can, starting with this. What, in your view, needs to happen to avert an all-out civil war in Iraq?
Well, it's easily said, it's very difficult to do, and that is both sides need to make compromises. You know, here I think that that Speaker Najafi and the Sunnis are right that it really needs to start with the Prime Minister. It's not that the Prime Minister is worse or better than any of these groups, it's just that he is the Prime Minister. And as a result, many of the actions that he's taken have been the most damaging because they have incited the most fear because he is the Prime Minister. So it does need to start with him, but his opposition needs to be just as receptive. There has to be compromise. We have to get back to the power sharing agreement that the United States forged in 2008-2009, where the Sunnis were brought back into the government. They were given a share of political power and economic wealth equivalent to their demography. That's what allowed Iraq to really make progress and enjoy stability and real political progress in 2009-2010.
And do you feel that the delivery of pretty sophisticated weapons systems, for example, the Hellfire missiles and the surveillance drones by the American government to the Iraqi government, does that assist what you were just talking about?
This is a great question. And I don't think that we know the answer yet. There are reasons you could put it on either side. So one possibility is that this simply emboldens the Prime Minister to say he should just crush the rebels, he should just crush the resistance, not make any compromises because he now has all of this firepower. That would be disastrous if it were the case. I think the hope is that by providing this weaponry, it's the U.S. government in effect buying influence. Maliki wants this. It's important for Maliki going into his election to show his people that he's getting this kind of security assistance. The truth is, Apache helicopters are not good weapons for fighting insurgents, and it's not the right way to think about dealing with an insurgency, is to think about how you crush it militarily. There needs to be a political compromise. But the hope is that by providing this military support, it'll buy us the leverage that we need to help convince Prime Minister Maliki that he needs to make those compromises that I was talking about.
There is that great old foreign affairs line, though. If I am strong, why should I compromise? If I am weak, how can I compromise? How does this help advance the world? Exactly. How does this advance the goalposts at all?
Well, as I said, you know, the line that you just mentioned is something that I've repeatedly cited when talking about Iraq, and in particular about Prime Minister Maliki's approach to the situation. And I think that's one of the principal reasons why Iraq is in the state that it's currently in. And again, I think that the real hope is that outsiders, like the U.S. government, will be able to convince him that he is strong enough to make compromise. And the problem that we have had is that because of the mistakes of both the Bush and Obama administrations, the United States has really left itself with very little leverage in Iraq. And the question is, how do we rebuild that leverage and what do we do with it? I think that perhaps by providing the security assistance that the Prime Minister so desperately wants, maybe we will be able to rebuild that leverage. If we do, we've got to convince him to make the kind of compromises that he's so far resisted.
Ken Pollack from the Brookings Institution, very good of you to join us on TVO tonight and help explain this to us. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.